Welcome to Equipping Leaders, a podcast where I share and discuss resources, tools, and information to equip leaders to build creative, cohesive teams through culture and leader development. Welcome to the Equipping Leaders podcast. I am your host, Natasha, and today I am sharing part 2 of a solocast on courageous conversations. In the last solocast on courageous conversations, I talked about what these conversations are, the relationships we must build for them to be successful, and the mindset we need to have when we engage in them. And today we're going to kick it right off and we're going to start talking about emotions. There was a time when we did not even discuss emotions in the workplace, except for anger, but they normally just said that was somebody having a bad day. All emotions exist in the workplace, whether we let them play out naturally or not. Let me also say that it's not necessarily appropriate to let our emotions play out. There have been days when I thought, I am mad enough to flip a desk. But actually flipping a desk is wildly inappropriate. Yelling at the people you work with is wildly inappropriate. Sobbing every time someone asks you a question is inappropriate. We can have our emotions and express them like an adult and like a professional, and then give ourselves space later to fully engage with everything the emotion wants from us. One of the identifiers of courageous conversations is that it can bring up powerful emotions for those involved. We can make space for that and not let the emotions hijack the conversation. Anytime we give feedback that an individual does not perceive about themselves, there's a chance that they can get defensive. That defensiveness can come out as anger, frustration, grief, sadness, or any number of corresponding emotions. In these conversations, it's also important to acknowledge that emotions cannot sidetrack us and make things okay. They are real and natural, and we can give people space to be upset, but it does not take away from the message that needs to be delivered. When we experience emotions before, during, and after these conversations, the most valuable thing that we can do is acknowledge the emotion, take a breath, and continue on. Now, I know this sounds like super zen. It's for the benefit of the conversation that we do this. We can dive into and unpack our emotions more later. In the moment and in that conversation, we have an opportunity to be there for the other person and ourselves in delivering or receiving the message. If you're leading the conversation and you sense that strong emotions are coming up, you can make space for those in the conversation. You can ask, what is coming up for you right now? Then give the other person the space to express it. This can tell you a lot more about the situation than if you just roll through it and work to get your points across. Now, that way it can be effective, but certainly not as effective as a two-way conversation. Remember, emotions are natural and they will come up, and we need to acknowledge and deal with them. However, there are appropriate times for this that allow us to really understand the emotion in ourselves more fully, and the middle of a courageous conversation is not the right time or place. So we've talked about what courageous conversations are, the relationships, mindset, and emotions around them, and now let's talk more practically. How can we set ourselves and others up for these conversations? So first, do not rush into these interactions unless it is absolutely necessary. Instead, give the person at least a day to prepare themselves. It is important to do this mindfully, of course. Don't just say, we need to talk tomorrow, because something like that can just send another person spiraling because they have no context. And they just think, oh, my boss wants to talk to me and I'm probably in trouble, and it will just all go downhill from there. So instead, when you approach them, you want to give them more details, state your expectations, and how they can best prepare for the session as well. For example, you could say, tomorrow at 2 p.m., I'd like to give you some feedback on your latest performance. It was not where it needed to be, but I would like to discuss it with you and get your take on it. Between now and our meeting, I would also like for you to reflect on it and think of any questions you have or support that you would need moving forward. I want this to be a collaborative session. How does that sound? This provides them more details and sends the message that there is a concern, but you want their side and you want to discover ways to move forward together. The next practical thing that you can do is write out a script for what you want to say. Don't just get into this mental role playing though. So don't say, I'll say this and I think they'll say this. Instead, you're really just outlining your main points and some questions that you'd like to ask the other person. Sometimes you can use these scripts in the conversation as notes if that's helpful. But for some, I know for myself, it's helpful to think it through, get it out on paper, and then leave those notes behind. That way I can be really fully present and not feel like I'm looking at notes the whole time. Some people may think, oh man, this is like a lot of preparation, but the point is that it is mindful preparation, and both you and the person you're speaking with deserves this level of care. Right before the session, to help calm your own mind, you can take a few deep breaths and remember to not assume that the interaction will be negative. Even if it gets negative, go back to those deep breaths. Just breathe through it. Follow-up is extremely valuable, and that's the last practical part that we'll talk about. It should not be immediate, so not an hour after the session, but it should be soon enough to not leave people feeling left out in the cold. It also allows for any additional thoughts and insight to emerge and to be dealt with before it becomes a long-term thing that's just hovering over both of you. I hope you enjoyed this mini-series on courageous conversations. I know that in the future I will come back to this topic a lot because they're consistently uncomfortable and difficult, and it's always helpful to give more information and insight on them. This mini-series was really intended to just give us all a baseline for what a courageous conversation is and how we can start to deal with them. Next week, I will be sharing a conversation with leadership facilitator and leader developer Kristen Tusser on how leadership styles show up in today's workplace. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Equipping Leaders podcast. For more leadership development content, you can visit my website, natashacheyenne.com, where you will find my leadership journal with dozens of articles and the Cultivation Cafe, which is always growing and has leadership frameworks, book recommendations, and inclusion and mental health resources. You can also follow me on Instagram at novel_Natasha or at Equipping Leaders Podcast, and on Twitter at Natasha Cheyenne. Join me next week for another episode.